So this is, I'm going to be handing it off to Buck, but this is a panel about the world's greatest comedian and the world's greatest filmmaker, asterisk. Because I know that that's contentious, and I know that I'm not getting into a film Twitter fight right now. This is about Jack and Orson Welles. And to best explain what we're going to do here, I bring it over to the one and only Buck Benny OTR.
Well, this is fun. We were looking forward to this. I'm just so glad that my panel was able to come in and join us. We have Vincent Longo here, who's new to a lot of you folks, but he is Jack Benny. He's an Orson Welles historian, really, and a historian overall as well. But his insights into what Orson's going through on any particular occasion in time is pretty cool. That he can add in here, and then of course we have Kathy Fuller-Seeley, who's done just a few books there on Jack Benny. And we have me, who's done nothing but podcasts on Jack Benny.
And nothing. That's not nothing.
And our good friend Zach. So anyway, we're going to be talking about Orson Welles and just Orson Welles' impact on the Jack Benny show and Jack Benny's impact on Orson Welles, because it goes both ways. We'll be talking the main piece of this is that Jack had gotten sick. We're thinking it was something like pneumonia, and was out for, I think, 5 weeks, 6 weeks.
Give the date. Give a starting date.
I don't have the starting dates. You need to have the starting dates. I was planning on this being 11 o'clock. Hey,
March 1943 until early April 1943. Yes. And then Welles did an early episode with Jack in 1940 when he was starting his career in Hollywood. So basically we're talking about 6 episodes.
Yeah, and that's the good starting point, because the notion of Welles in comedy is kind of what's at the forefront of this discussion, and consequently how it would influence him greatly. And he was, I know Buck and I were talking about this last night. We were trying to figure out if he had been on Fred Allen before or after, and I still believe it's after, because because he's one of the few people comedian wise that I hear making an active Citizen Kane joke during his program is Fred Allen. Jack obviously does not touch it. Could we start with that first one, the one with Hunchback of Notre Dame? Because I think it's the good one to start with, obviously.
Yeah, that's where I wanted to start things off. But the bulk of it will be when he was taking over for Jack later. But anyway, so in 1940, does anyone have the exact date on that one?
It's early. It's like February or March as well. I can't remember exactly,
but very good. We'll look it up for you. But anyway, so Orson came in as a guest on the Jack Benny show. And Jack's writers decided to play with the fact that Orson is kind of a wonderkin and in charge of everything, and so they really played off of that, and it came across really, really well. It worked and Jack being kind of a hyper fan that wanted to get all this input on, and so that he could be a great actor himself and be involved with Orson. It's a wonderful episode, really. And I'm just gonna throw it over to let's throw it over to Vincent and get Vincent's thought on do you know why that all of a sudden Orson decided to be on a Jack Benny show? I mean, as far as I know, it was the first comedy show that he kind of showed up on, and
March 17th, 1940.
1940,
Perfect.
Yeah. So, I mean, I want to start with first a meta commentary and to say that how lovely this whole convention is. And there'll be a point to this, because I've spoken at many Orson Welles conventions, Orson Welles panels. And as Zach sort of alluded to, there are actual fights and yelling and screaming, and there's a lot of concern over Welles.
That could happen. That might happen in here. We'll see.
I mean, and I welcome it. But what I've seen has been very lovely. And I think the point is that, this is showing a different side of Orson Welles than is often talked about in Orson Welles circles. Welles as a comedian is something Welles personally was always interested in and hoped for, but, never really became sort of a part of his persona or legacy. And so this is a really nice different side of Orson Welles. And it's nice to, everyone cheering each other on is just a general note on panelists. So I'm happy for that. Why was Welles doing this in 1940, this first episode? So he was transitioning to making Citizen Kane. This was very early in actually producing Citizen Kane when he came to Hollywood in 1939 as this sort of wonderkind with this Hollywood contract that gave him, basically total artistic control over, what was supposed to be 4 films ended up being 1.5, 2. He was trying to make an adaptation of Heart of Darkness, basically all the end of 1939. It didn't happen for lots of reasons. And so he's transitioning to make Citizen Kane. So I actually think this is sort of in a blip of time where he has a little bit more time and is not on set. And so, again, they're trying to build up, Welles and his people around him are trying to build him up as a celebrity in Hollywood and as a filmmaker and as a great artist, which he, of course, had a reputation from doing Campbell Playhouse and Mercury Theater and things like that. But, as a filmmaker, that's still sort of growing. And the play in this episode is that they're trying to, he's making a film and all this. And so that's why he, I think, appears on this episode and decides to, take the invitation to come.
Yeah.
Very good. Kathy, what do you think about his first appearance?
Well, I'm curious. I want to ask Vincent now. Orson, did he still have any CBS radio connections? Did CBS have their hooks in him to continue anything about the Campbell Playhouse? Or so sometimes it was hard for a performer on one network to be able to appear on the other, and so the Benny Allen feud could happen because they were both on NBC at the same time. So I'm curious, was there any? Did they have to get Pope's dispensation to?
It's a great question. I don't remember the exact timeline here, but Welles dips out of the radio for the most part around this period. And so I doubt it. This is him, I think, free from some shackles at this time. Yeah.
Because he's focused on what any 23 to 24-year-old would be, which is, I've been given the most unprecedented contract in Hollywood history, and they expect me to deliver. It's kind of remarkable in that respect that it's just like you hear him on here and he sounds so beyond his years, but like this is a kid running around Hollywood that's been given the keys to the kingdom in a lot of respects, not necessarily financially, but creatively.
Yeah. But I love this episode for 2 reasons. One is it is an encapsulation of this wonderkind aspect, right? If you listen to it, it's, Welles is basically too good for everyone else. He's totally in control. He's solidified as this great intellectual artist and all that, very Shakespearean, taken very seriously. But on the other hand, he's not good at comedic performances. He's not used to this. And so he's laughing the entire episode. It's this great moment where everything is just sort of like Welles laughing at Jack's delivery, everyone's delivery. And so you see sort of like the cracks of this really overly intellectual persona that they're playing up, but is well understood in Hollywood at this time. So it's a great sort of like combination of aspects of Welles, really loving comedy, having a great time, not doing all that great in terms of, trying to keep his character. But again, I really love that episode for this reason.
What does the public think about Welles at this time? Because this is pre Citizen Kane, this is post War of the Worlds, so I assume the public knows him as the War of the Worlds guy and this guy that shook up all radio and scared the nation supposedly. And they also probably know, I assume it's widely known that he's got this ultra contract to jump into film. But he hasn't yet done that. He hasn't yet produced that they've seen. So that's kind of where they're at with him. Is that generally the consensus of the public, that they understand that he's got this thing and he's going to be making pictures?
I don't think that they know about his contract at all. I'm not sure. I mean, that was obviously talked about in the trades, but they might have been a loose thing, in newspapers, but it wasn't what he was known for. Certainly by this point, he's known heavily for War of the Worlds. The RKO, the studio he was working for, wanted him to make a film adaptation of War of the Worlds for his first film. It had like 100% approval rating in their polls and audience research and stuff like that. But the thing that's also evident in this episode is there's almost no discussion of War of the Worlds. I think in this one, if I remember correctly, Dennis makes a joke about, Wells scaring people. And it's just sort of as a joke quickly put in there. But I think there's two reasons for that. One is Wells did not like talking about War of the Worlds because he felt pigeonholed at this time. He felt that it detracted from him being an artist and intellectual, which he largely considered himself to be, as much as he was interested in comedy. And so it's only thrown in there very sparingly. And a lot of the stuff that Wells does from 1939 to like 1941's before Citizen Kane is a lot about trying to move away from any association with scaring people, with being a sort of a hoaxer, prankster. These are things that he lived with at this time period that he becomes okay with later. But I think that's why it's not a major thing in the show. It's just kind of thrown in there. And it's really just playing up him as a, way better than everyone else at everything. I think the funniest part about this episode is that not only Wells is sort of treated as really smart, but that everybody in Wells's team, there's a bunch of secretaries in this episode, they're way better at acting than everyone else as well, his own secretaries. Like there's this joke about Jack being worse at acting than Wells's secretary or something like that. And so again, he wanted to be taken, I think, very seriously, and that's a part of this episode.
Yeah, I think so. And I didn't realize that Hollywood wanted him to bring War of the Worlds to film. I always respect people when they're known for one gigantic thing like that, and then they're like, oh, the logical thing is for you to do this, and then the artist can say, yeah, that might be the logical thing, but it's not what I want to do. Here's what I want to do.
This was at a period of time, the same way that Jack is making Man About Town and A Buck Benny Rides Again. Hollywood's in a deep funk. Attendance is not rising. They're having trouble that no one knows how to reach the film audience, and radio is flying high. So pollster George Gallup is hired by Hollywood studios to come out and tell them what to do. And Gallup is saying Jack Benny should be the #1 movie star because look how well he is promoting his own films, pre-selling the films on the radio. So that makes the desire to borrow more glory from radio and do a War of the Worlds.
And maybe Zach knows more on that. To me, I'd never get this. This is the part when I talk to you guys where it's a disconnect in my brain, because 1939 is like this historic year where so many pictures come out that are just insanely good. And this, you have these wonderful things, Wizard of Oz, all these things coming out. And yet I hear from you guys that in 1940, everybody's struggling and they can't, how do you make money? And how do you make a good picture?
In 1939, The Wizard of Oz was a bust. So it's the difference between how we value these films now versus what was happening at the time. So,
but that's where it's incongruent in my brain. I'm like, these movies must have done well.
We're still in a depression at that point. We don't get out of the depression fully until this country mobilizes for war. Right. Like the with all the help that the WPA, the Works Projects Administration did, this country is still financially struggling, and it's not an easy thing for everybody, even today, to be able to afford a movie. Like now, things were done, progressive actions were taken that we've seen the benefits of down the line, but it's still, at that time, like a lot of those actions are being fought against a stone wall that was a conservative party at that point, which was also keeping us from helping out in the war in Europe at that time until Pearl Harbor. So there's a lot of factors in that respect that allow us to consider why that would be the case, and also why RKO would want War of the Worlds over something that's a risk like Citizen Kane or Heart of Darkness, because it's assured money, it's guaranteed in the bank. And I wanted to point something out because of how popular it was. Here's something that you can notice. About a week or two later after this episode, I think it is actually a week later, Morrow and Boulogne are on their best behavior with Orson. But once he's out of the room, they reference War of the Worlds because of this sunspots issue with the sun. And they have Jack calling Orson over the phone. You can't hear Orson, obviously. And he goes like, now come clean, Orson. What did you do with the sun? So the moment Morrow and Boulogne can get away with it, those two are going to get away with it. So, but clearly it wasn't enough for them for Orson to be sore about it because he came back.
Well, and Zach, do we know, or anybody on the panel know, as far as I can tell, what I would assume is it's one of these deals where he's on Jack's show essentially for free, and then Jack shows up on his show. He does June Moon like right around this time frame, doesn't he?
It's
he does.
Very next week.
Yeah. So wouldn't that be one of those exchange things, or do we know? I don't know.
I think it is an exchange thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely an exchange thing. So I was just looking at this article, which is talking about, Kathy was talking about polls. So this is a poll in 1940, a little bit before this. Certainly I think Welles wins out here. It says here that Jack Benny's program is #1 in the polls, both for overall and comedy. Welles is number 9 behind a bunch of others for overall, but he's the second highest in terms of like dramas. And so it's, clearly a switch here. Wells's show is ending, like we just talked about. So he's sort of getting out of it for Hollywood, but
and Wells's show is Campbell's Playhouse or something, right? At this point?
Yeah, at this time it would have been Campbell's Playhouse. Although I think soon, again, that gets dropped because Campbell doesn't love what he's doing either. So
right. I assume they like June Moon. I mean, June Moon was probably the most whatever populist-based sort of thing where they're bringing in Jack Benny and having him do a show. I mean, that is that June Moon presentation is really interesting and a fun one to hear Jack on a different show. It's done fairly tongue in cheek and so forth, and so it's a lot of fun to have have Orson the fish out of water on Jack's show, and then have Jack immediately the fish out of water on Orson's show is kind of a fun combination of the two back and forth. Anyway, but they'd established essentially this persona of Orson in this case. And then Fred Allen decided, well, I can kind of jump on that and have Orson on my show doing the same sort of thing. And so then we follow him onto Fred's show. And what do folks think about his appearance on Fred's show? That's about a year later in 41-ish.
41, 42. I only have one note about it, which is, of all the shows that I have heard, and I'm not an OTR expert like some other people in the room, but I love OTR. I've never heard anybody say the word Citizen Kane on a radio show that didn't have anything to do with Orson. And I love listening to Fred Allen slyly quip about the controversy, because you can read about it, you can hear the legend, you can listen to Welles' version, you can listen to Hausman's version, and then you can listen to them fight about it. But the bottom line is that it's so interesting to hear that, and it's clear that something happened a couple weeks before to instigate the narrative structure of that episode, which is Welles is like, no, I'm not offended, Fred. In fact, I want you to help me with a play. And then he just relegates Allen to this role of somebody who only has one line of dialogue or knocks on the door. And then Peter Van Steeden or Al Goodman, whoever was his orchestra leader at the time, is cueing it too soon intentionally. So, yeah.
And that's essentially the same bit that he does on Jack's show, right? Where Jack hardly has anything to say, and shouldn't I be saying more?
But it will be with Mary.
Right.
So how interesting that the way Orson and Jack work is that Jack gets to be made sort of foolish and stupid, whereas I think with the appearance with Fred Allen, who we think of as sort of smarter, more culturally aware, that how they pitch it is Orson just not giving Fred a word edgewise. Would you?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's the same structure. I mean, I actually think it's, the Fred Allen version is quite derivative. It's got some different dynamics, given, like you said, Fred is a little bit different, but they even mention, I think they sort of call out its own derivativeness at one point. They mention like, oh, well, you did this on Fred Allen's or on Jack Benny's show, so you can definitely survive this, the usual Fred Allen dig on Jack Benny. But yeah, it's pretty much the same. Yeah, it's worth listening to, but I think the Jack one is a little bit fresher. Sort of created the outline that Fred Allen would use. So,
well, and it goes back to the whole thing with radio that we luckily were blessed with the fact that we can listen to all these radio shows and compare them back and forth and everything. But at the time, Fred's team are going, well, it's been over a year or something. How many people are going to remember what he did on Jack's show a year later? We can revisit it. That's not a problem. Whereas now you go, ooh, I probably would have done something a little bit different take to make it not seem so much like a rehash of the Jack Benny appearance.
Yeah, Edgar Bergen and Charlie McCarthy's show where they have Orson on, which I always find endlessly amusing because that's the program that seemingly people dial surfed over on War of the Worlds. They literally changed that around to having Orson give Charlie and Edgar a tour of a museum, which may or may not be a precursor to the Black Museum. Probably not.
Do we know when that show was done? When Orson was on Charlie McCarthy?
I think it's like 42, 43 or something like that. I could be way off. I have it on one of my comedy sets over here.
Yeah.
Vamp for a minute.
I mean, one thing that I would say that's still true in Fred Allen, and this is going to matter when we start talking about these 1943 versions, but it's still the same Welles persona that's being played with, right? Welles, the overbearing director, the intellectual who wants to control everything, far superior to everybody else, because that's always what they're going to play with, even in 1943, but it's going to shift. And we'll talk about why that's important, that it's going to shift in 1943 versus Fred Allen's continuation of the same sort of persona of Welles.
He's still looking. As he keeps looking, we'll keep going. But I believe that one falls after
43 or 44. Sorry.
Okay.
There's Charlie.
So that one follows definitely after the Fred Allen appearance, perhaps before the Jack Benny he takes over for Jack, or after he takes over for Jack. We're not sure. Right around that same time frame is what it sounds like. Zach, is that correct?
I think so. Yeah, Kathy.
He takes over Jack in March of 43.
Yeah. Oh, yes.
Then we have a period where Orson is highly, totally involved finally with making Citizen Kane and its appearance and the controversies. So when Orson does Jack an incredibly solid favor of coming in, he's not just an invitee, but he's coming back to the show in 43?
Yep. March 43.
Under different circumstances.
Yeah.
And right before that, before he comes on, the Jack is sick. The episode, so he has to have replacements come in for him. He has Burns and Allen come on the show, take over for a week. Essentially, that one's treated almost like a Burns and Allen show with Jack's cast guesting. It's interesting how that show plays out. Then Jack is still gone. They ask Orson to come in. We're not sure how many weeks they figure for Orson to come in or whether they're just planning on one. Vincent says 2, that they were planning on 2. So that's good. So, which makes sense because the 2 that they do kind of work as standalones, and then they go a different direction in the 3rd episode. So this first one where Orson appears, Mary's with Jack. So Mary's not on the episode, assuming she's helping take care of Jack or making sure that he's doing all right or whatever, or she's got another bout of laryngitis, whatever. And then we do have Phil that's been gone for 16 weeks in the Merchant Marines with apparently his band in the Merchant Marines. Mm-hmm. They all come back on this date, and this is where Phil's back, and they do a lot of Phil comes on like full bore Phil in this one, and it's really Phil and Orson that lead this episode. But it is such a fun, wonderful episode, and this whole arc that is going to happen with Orson, whether it's an inadvertent arc or a purposeful arc or half and half sort of thing, it's really quite impressive. And as we walk through it, each episode has something that stands out about, something that's unique about it that we can talk about. Anyway, we'll start with this first one where Orson takes over for Jack, and I'll throw it over to Vincent to get sort of his thoughts on what's going on right now in Orson Welles' life, and why do you think this sort of all happened? And what do you think of the episode itself? Go ahead, Vincent.
Yeah. So, in 1943, Welles's celebrity and sort of reputation in Hollywood and in radio has shifted dramatically. There's still a little bit of the sort of wonderkind artist, intellectual, but he's sort of shamed. Citizen Kane was not a major hit by any means. Magnificent Ambersons, his second film, was chopped up by the studio over budget. Then he went, with the invitation by the U.S. government to Brazil to make a movie, which was supposed to be, just kind of flashy and happy. And he ended up trying to make a film about race relations in Brazil and class issues. They hated that, took him out of Brazil. And basically he was, depicted and talked about as a spendthrift, as somebody who couldn't take direction, didn't listen to authority, made horrible decisions. And this is sort of the new persona of Welles that we see played with this in this episode for comedy. One of the things that I wanted to mention before I elaborate on that a little bit more is that Orson Welles mentions Jack Benny one time in his biography. It's essentially an autobiography, but it's written largely by Barbara Leeming in the 80s. And he mentions Jack Benny particularly as encapsulating the Welles persona that haunted Welles throughout his entire life. And as one thing that I would say is, I think Welles is right, but it does shift here from the 1940s sort of wonderkind to the 1943 one. And in this episode, it's really is funny, but it's much different for Welles. He makes horrible decisions the entire time. So he's still very overbearing, very intellectual. But at one point he wants Don Wilson to sing instead of Dennis. He calls Grape Nuts and yells at the sponsor and says, we need to change all these things. What's the idea? Oh, you need to have one single grape nut in the whole package. And also Welles should be on the cover of the box wearing tights instead of Jack.
And carrying a spear.
Exactly. He also reads his own script and then changes everything to the polar opposite. So it's like $1 million changes. And so you can see here a dramatic change from what was in 1940, which is Welles doing all these horrible things that nobody would think is a good idea, and he's spending tons of money. And so he is playing with his own perception here, I think, in a really creative, fun way.
My favorite part is when they play with Phil, who Phil is, because Phil comes back, of course, and they play at the same time with Orson and what you know him for. So they're spraying down all the microphones and everything, and then when are you Mr. Harris or whatever? And yes, and so then they spray down Phil Harris, which totally makes sense that if you're going to decontaminate things, you're going to decontaminate Phil Harris. There's Well, Kathy, what do you think about this first episode?
Everything you all have said, the idea of Jack was always so terrified of his sponsor, would do anything to, keep the show going another season and things like that. So indeed, the chutzpah of Orson Welles to just call up and demand these things. It was delightful to hear, and you can imagine the Jack character in bed in Chicago or wherever, just sort of quaking.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, these first
Welles
ones
did have problems with his own sponsors as well, I should say, in radio, which would follow him the rest of his career. Not only Campbell Playhouse, but if you've listened to other Buck Benny podcasts, pretty much he loses every sponsor for the rest of his career.
Yeah,
usually in the middle of the show.
It can't even get one. Was it? We're doing the Eversharps not too long ago. He can't even get them past the pilot stage.
Yeah,
they have the ads embedded, but they don't even release the show.
It's just don't worry about it. Nobody's gonna care about his commentaries. Certainly not a podcast years later.
Now, is it in this episode where Rochester is engaged as? Is it this episode or the next episode where Rochester is now going to work for Orson Welles?
Next one. That's the next one.
Next one.
Okay. So
yeah.
Yes, I guess in this episode, Rochester is also with Jack and Mary in the narrative.
That's right.
Yeah.
Chicago. So
Yeah, they do have a conversation on the phone, Wells and Rochester, but it's about Rita Hayworth.
Okay.
He mentions because Wells and Rita Hayworth had basically recently been dating, and there's a sort of joke that I think Rochester or somebody's going to make her a T-bone steak or something. Yeah,
that's right.
Well, and the one thing this episode has more of than they start playing it down a little bit, but they're still on next week's episode, is a lot of assistants to Orson that are on here. They're funny, they do a great job, but I think they had them thrown in just to kind of pad because they don't have Jack, and so they're going, okay, well, you need to make sure this works, and if Orson's going to stumble at all or anything, we've got this all padded up and don't have him doing as much. But then as this progresses, they free Orson more and more to be a bigger and bigger part of the show, and so forth. So that I think is what's kind of going on in the background too.
Well, yes, when you go back, our dear audience, when you go back and listen to these shows, they have Verna Felton, who had been Dennis's mother, come on and play the Miss Harrington, who's the officious and bossy lead secretary. And it's so interesting how she tries to shift her voice just a little bit so that you don't think it's Dennis's mother, but you know that it's a woman who likes to boss people around.
And it works. She shifts her voice just enough that, I mean, you can tell if you think about it, but it's like, no, she does a really nice job in this role. All of the assistants do. Is Frank Nelson one of the assistants on this one? I can't remember if he shows up.
He might be Mr. Toodlequirtle.
Oh, maybe that's it.
Toodlequirtle, yeah.
Yeah, great name.
And the way they carry those threads is fun because it carries at least Miss Harrington carries into the final appearance by Orson with Jack having returned. So I love how they kind of try to create a mini arc for her character because she does have an emotional release where she finally says, "I know just how you feel, Daddy," and and then Mary has the line, "Well, I'll be darned, she's human."
Right. Wow. Hello, Butch.
Hello, Slugger.
Well, and I'll point out that we're going to cover a lot of ground here. We're spending just a few minutes on each episode so we can cover some of this. But we also, for when they come up, which they'll be up next month, I play them on their anniversary dates. Our whole team here will be presenting on each episode, and each time we talk about an episode, we're probably going to go about as long as we go here to talk about all of them. So if you wanted a deeper dive into that, tune into the podcast when that comes up here next month. And the other piece I'll throw out there too, just as a quick blurb, we also all kind of appear on the Orson Welles Wednesdays that we have, where we talk about the commentaries and things. So you might want to tune into that when we have that on Wednesdays on our podcast as well, on the Jack Benny Show OTR podcast. Anyway, so there we go. So let's keep moving. So now, after that plug, let's go to this second episode. So the second one, they visit Orson's studio, which to me was a great idea. Let's take the cast and go visit the studio and see what happens then. For this episode and future episodes, the whole run, I love that we have these. I love that it's we get the cast in a different way than we usually do. Usually we get the cast all relating. Jack says something and talks to Don, and Don to Jack, and then Jack to Mary, and then Jack talks to Dennis, Jack to Dennis, Jack to Dennis. You don't get the cast talking to each other all that much on the show. With this, because Jack's out of the picture for this whole time, you end up with lots of Jack talking. I mean, lots of Mary talking to Phil, lots of Mary talking to Dennis, talking to Don to Phil. I mean, you get a lot of cross chatter going on that you don't normally get as much. And Mary's back on this one, so the big thing is Mary's return, and she makes a nice big return in this one. We love having her. Anyway, so that's the thrust that I see of this episode. But let's go ahead and let's go over to Kathy and see what her thoughts are on the second one.
Those are great points, Daryl, because it points up how sort of more three-dimensional that these side characters are in the Benny Show versus what happens on other comedians' sort of variety comedy shows where they're sort of have one catchphrase and really, not much of a character after that. That they, in a way, on the other hand, this is Jack's show. And what a dilemma, what a crisis they are facing, that he is so ill and now gone. This is the third week in a row. So I'm sure the sponsor's all upset and worried. And Jack is probably, sick, but just terrified. How do you keep the show going? How do you have people not abandon it? And so Orson is doing a marvelous favor and doing it quite well of continuing his character on, as well as Morrow and Beloit have really stepped up to the plate to be able to write this interesting character.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and Vincent, you had information like that you found, I think, that this was supposed to be a 2-week thing, and was it already pre-planned or something? Like they were going to do this, like it was Jack on vacation.
That's right.
Or something, or I don't know what the.
Yeah. So Jack, I mean, he was on tour before this. And he got sick, but he was planning on taking a 2-week vacation or a 3-week vacation. First week with Vernon and Allens, and then 2 weeks with Orson. So that was planned before he got sick. Yeah, it's pretty long. That's pretty long. And then he gets sick, and so then they extend it out from there. And so Wells was planning on being in the show at least 2 episodes, and then this would be the final of those 2 episodes, which I think we should note is strange because there's a literal arc. A narrative arc between these episodes, which I think people mention is not that common. Like at the end of the last episode, Wells invites them to come to the studio, and then this episode is them coming to the studio.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it was planned before Jack got sick.
Wow.
Can I?
He never. It's very rare that he ever takes another vacation during the middle of the season again.
Yeah. And I want to point out that the funniest thing about this episode, it's the only comment I have on it, is I think it's hilarious that the writers would think that Orson would have his own production studio. That is hilarious to me, because it's not any shade on Orson. I love the man to death and all of his films, actually, but it's such a funny joke in hindsight because of what we know about his relationships with studios all throughout his life, and the fact that the writers had the gumption and gall to be like, well, he's got his own production studio. Wonder if Orson's kind of looking at it going like, ha, that's funny.
I wish. Yeah.
That's funny. Really, really cute joke, boys.
Well, and they do such a beautiful job coming to his studio and just having fun. I mean, I really enjoy this episode.
This could have something to do with, if Jack is contracted to Paramount at this point, they couldn't, maybe they couldn't say Arcade.
Oh, that is a good point.
So you never know all the
I didn't even think about that. So. That's a great point. Because that would have been, because you talk about it in your book, Kathy, about how one studio won't trump on another, and some of the Yeah. Oh,
Zach, how are we doing for time? Because I'm just kind of judging how long we can spend on each episode.
I think we've got at least another 10 minutes before we probably should wind down.
Okay.
But
so let's keep moving through then. Let's go to the next episode. Now it changes direction entirely yet again, because like Vincent was saying, they sort of planned on the first 2. So the first 2 kind of worked together, and now it's like, okay, what are we going to do now? You could just see the brains of the writers going, well, let's do one of our murder mystery things and have Orson involved in this, and we could have Mary do her over the top. Who did she imitate always? Kathy?
It had been Mae West, but now it turns into a kind of film noir femme fatale.
Yeah, but I love it when she does it. And this is one of her best ones. She really does a good job with this one. Anyway, fun episode throughout this one. And they're starting to jettison a lot more of the supporting people that were his assistants and so forth, and focus on the main cast of the show, carrying the show, along with Orson sort of just replacing Jack as lead in the show. And I think it's a fun change that sort of happens, and I
And-
love that Vincent. I mean, sorry, it looks like you got something to say, Zach.
Oh,
so.
and I was going to say, and then in place of that, you get Orson starting to have internal dilemmas because he says the line, "Yes, Mr. Wells. Yes, Mr. Wells. Sometimes I wish I wasn't a genius so people could quibble with me." And I'm like, oh my God, this is cool. We're getting a character out of
Yeah.
Orson here. It's like he's got thoughts. He's 4-dimensional now. That's awesome.
Yes, they start to develop him as more of a character in these because they're going, okay,
Yeah.
well, we don't know how long this is going to keep going, so I guess we need to develop Orson, and it works. I mean, it really works nicely, and these are very enjoyable episodes. It's not like you're going to go, oh, there's a guest host or whatever. Let's skip these episodes and just get back to the ones with Jack, because it's really neat to hear the cast themselves gelling so well with each other. The writers really stepping up to the plate, and then of course you got Orson on top of it. Vincent, what do you got on this one, or what do you think?
Yeah, so starting in the last episode, but especially this episode, like you said, Wells becomes a character, and in many ways he becomes the really sort of a replacement lead for Jack, literally so much that in the narrative he lives at Jack's house and Rochester is his butler and not Jack's temporarily. And so, we start to lose some of the really specific parts of Wells's persona. Like he's not anymore like spending a bunch of money or making really dumb decisions. He's really eccentric. Like he is eating very expensive food, and he's always introduced with trumpets and a gong, which I think is absolutely hilarious. But again, we start to see these running jokes with Orson Welles I think I said at some other time, but we start imagining Welles as a character that maybe could pop in later throughout the series. Like he really does get running jokes. The other thing, though, that I think is absolutely crucial is he starts to build a really genuine rapport with Rochester's character. It's a stark contrast to what we see with Jack. Even in the last episode in this series, when Jack comes back, Wells is super nice with Rochester. He gives him stuff that, Rochester says many times, like, working with you, Mr. Wells, is paradise. I love it. I wish I could come work for you afterward. As I think it is worth noting, it's not only narratively, but, Wells is a big champion for civil rights and, better representation for African Americans. And we see this played out, whether it was Wells' idea or the writers. He's not mean. He doesn't make fun of Rochester pretty much ever.
And you totally feel when he talks his voice changes entirely when he talks to Rochester. It's his caring, supporting, I care about you as a person. I'm interested in what you have to say. It's really touching, and he does it's some of the best acting I think he does on the whole thing. Is he really lets audiences in on, hey, there's a relationship between Orson and Rochester, and it's special, and Rochester's a special person, and I love that.
Yeah,
very good. Then let's jump into, so the next one is they do Little Red Riding Hood, and a lot of fun doing Little Red Riding Hood. Another great choice by the writers to do this. This one, I think these last two have featured the writers as the characters that they play of the soda jerks, sort of the guys.
Radcliffe and Gilroy, my favorite soda jerks.
And this one or the episode after this, I can't remember which one's which, but it's their last appearance as those characters that they will ever do on the Jack Benny Show, and it's just fun. I love those characters. I love whenever they've appeared on Jack's show, and having them appear and relate to the cast members and with Orson is a lot of fun. I love those parts that they have. I think they're featured in 2 episodes. It might have been the last one in this one, or this one in the next one. But anyway.
Yeah, and they have great lines. Like I'm not a fan of sizist humor per se, but like I love when they're going like, "Would you like to stay and listen to your little opus?" And they go, "Can we stay? We can't stay. That fat lady's waiting for her cheeseburger." It's just the way he's delivering the line. I'm just like, this is silly. This is too darn silly.
Yes.
It's the inflection in his voice. I love it.
This is the episode where they start to play with Orson Welles as a character too, right? Because as I said many times before, he's taken like as intellectual, as very serious. In the other episodes, he always does a dramatic reading at the end. This time it's Little Red Riding Hood, which of course, Welles would never do. And he actually performs very badly. Like he actually does bad acting. And it's actually the one time I think I've ever heard Orson Welles even pretend to be bad at acting. And so it's this really funny moment where they're playing with Welles. It's an ironic, way of presenting Welles. And I should say, we're talking about, the influence Jack Benny's show had on Welles. Shortly after this, less than a year later, Welles comes out with his own variety show and tries to make it as a comic. And so we can see this thread. It's not successful, I think, because, they didn't have as good a writers as Jack did. But this, I think this is really pumping Welles up to think, I can do this. I can be a comedian.
And the issue is that they don't, those writers for the Almanac later on don't allow Orson to be multidimensional. They keep on the trend of him being the genius and undisputed genius. And it just is like, no, Morrow and Boulogne are knocking him down a few pegs in these 2 episodes. And that's something that the Almanac doesn't allow for, which is interesting.
And it should. Yeah,
it should.
It unfortunately doesn't work because he is funny with the right writers writing for him and everything. And the Almanac, I think, would have worked. He had wonderful guest stars on the Almanac and things. It's just
Dennis was a
should
guest,
have had better writing. And just to throw this out for people because they might not know that it exists out there. I'm sure one of you remembers, which university is it that has all the
University of Indiana.
Thank you.
Yeah.
If you go to the University of Indiana's website and you find the Orson Welles collection, you can listen to the almanacs. And they all sound gorgeous. So I assume they're from Orson's private collection of these things. And so they'll have a lot of shows there, not just the almanacs, but the commentaries are the ones we've loved getting because before this, the commentaries, there was like 8 of them. And now there's all of them. There are like 65 of them or something.
Annette is pointing out it's IU Bloomington. So,
okay.
Yeah.
So it's a great place to go listen to them. They've mastered them in really nice sound quality. They haven't overdone anything. It's a very nice. It just sounds really, really good. So
yeah. I wanted to say if I took a minute to pull up a small clip about the one where Jack returns because I know we're heading towards that direction. Do you guys want to hear a little bit of how?
Yeah, let's hop into the one where Jack returns and you play the clip to introduce it. That sounds good.
All right, so everybody here, enjoy the dulcet tones of Jack Benny.
Here, Orson, it's peachy. Here, take the bed. I'll go out and hang on the clothesline. For heaven's sake. Now let's get going with this rehearsal, whether Mr. Welles is standing, sitting, or floating around the room. Now, the first thing to do is, Orson, come down here. He knows more magic. Now, the first thing to do is run over the dialogue.
Run over the dialogue? Oh, no, that'll never do. No.
What do you mean, no?
Comedy, Jack, should never be rehearsed. Repetition destroys its sparkle and spontaneity.
But
The
Orson,
important elements of a variety program are the songs and music.
Look,
now,
but Orson-
Dennis, I want you to run over your song so we can get an idea of its length.
Now, wait a minute, Orson. This rehearsal is my business. You're not even going to be on the show.
I know, but I shall be listening. It's about time we listeners had something to say. Sing, Dennis.
I see what you mean, sister.
Yeah, I figured that's the one I think we all love when we talk on off chat and it's one of my favorite Orson Welles things ever is something where he doesn't even say a word of a dialogue, but it's all around that mythos of him. And the line Orson come down here speaks so many visual volumes in your head compared to anything Orson could have even
As
done.
he's floating around the room, supposedly. Yeah, I love
just like a superhero, superhero of cinema.
Well,
and that's one of the ways. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Bob.
Okay. I was just going to say that's one of the ways that this works so well because we never know who's taking over. But it's just the fact that this whole arc, there's been something new with every episode, and Jack doesn't just come back and there's no Orson and he's sort of explaining, well, I'm back and Orson's gone. It's this nice little handoff between the two that caps the whole thing off, and I love that. But anyway, now back to you, Vincent. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, luckily what I was going to say dovetails very well with what you're going to say. So, I mean, the great thing about this episode is that Jack's coming back, but everybody's totally fine if Jack doesn't come back. That's like the joke, right? Like Mary's like, he's like, oh, Wells is not that great. He's like, what are you talking about? He's like the greatest actor. Everything he says is profound. Or later when the doctor comes in that episode and he goes, Jack's like, I got to get to my show. I got to record. And he's like, oh, what? Is Orson sick? And like, there's, this running joke of like, oh, Wells can do it. It's fine.
There's a week later, Dennis says a line where it's like, or maybe this. I think it's either this one or the next one. But Dennis says, "Gosh, the Orson Welles program without Orson Welles. I worry about things like that."
and yet, that Miss Harrington, played by Verna Felton, is now allowed to let her hair down and make fun of her boss and go, what a job and things like that. So they're really having fun with this.
That feels like the one time where Verna Felton spoke in a normal tenor or tremor at some point that wasn't the Blue Fairy and Cinderella, or the Fairy Godmother. Sorry, yeah.
I would love to have had. The only thing I miss in this that I would have loved to have had, or the week after this, is had Dennis's mom show up and have an argument between Dennis's mom and the other character, where both characters are going against each other. I don't know if she could change voices that quickly to go back and forth between them, but that would have been fun.
She could have been a Mel Blanc where it's like, I can inhabit two different characters at once, and I can do an imitation of Bugs Bunny doing an imitation of Daffy Duck,
Oh yeah, he did so many meta things. It's like crazy.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway.
So I'm curious, Vincent, what after this lovely sojourn of earning some money on the Jack Benny program, what did this boy Orson's career or state of mind? What happened right afterward?
Yeah, so not much happened afterward. Like I said, the almanac comes up. In 1944, he's starting to try to make a couple films. Those don't go anywhere. Like at this point, he's trying to make, talking about making, pushing stories of African Americans and their voices. He's trying to make a biopic of Burt Williams, the vaudevillian. Lots of things don't come to fruition. He tries the almanac. But anyway, yeah, not too much. Eventually, down the line, he makes The Stranger and things like that. But, it's funny, off screen, not part of this episode, Jack gave Orson Welles like a fake award for stepping in for him. I have a picture of it, which I'll share. There's one online too. And it's like this, It's like this stubby baby that Jack gives to him. And it's supposed to be this joke about Welles being like, young and a child and stuff like that. But it's this nice moment where I think, seems to cement Jack is really appreciative of stepping in for longer than was expected. And so I find that a nice conclusion to Wells's foray in the Jack Benny show.
And Zach, we have a question over here. I'm reading. It's, what is the almanac? Maybe you can explain a little bit about what the almanac was and maybe how long did it run for 2 years or a year? I think remember.
It'd be barely a year. So the almanac was
well, thank you, Zach. That was helpful.
You want me to step in and tell you?
Follow the sign of the flying red horse. I think it's Mobil or one of the gas companies, but they sponsored an almanac, a version of what Orson was doing in these comedy runs on Jack's program. And it's set up like a variety show. He has his own little clique of characters. One of the unique things about it is that he begins the show with facts that kind of are strewn about, and then there's one fake / funny fact that that then leads into the comedy. And there's an element of the Orson Welles fan club, which consists of 4 women, and actually they lose one member at one point to the Frank Sinatra Club. And the interesting things to note about it for me are actually, like, among them is that, one, he gets a plethora of guest stars, but the tone seems off and uneven. And it's, again, he's not allowed to be knocked down a few pegs. It's almost like the writers are afraid to do it, even though Welles himself would have probably cherished it. But also he has Hedda Hopper on in one episode, and Hedda Hopper is sort of partially responsible for the big blow up with Kane, because she got a screen. She saw Kane early, and then she bragged about it, and then Luella. I might be getting the whole niche of it wrong, Vincent. You might have to correct me, but basically, Hedda saw it before Luella, and Luella was a Hearst columnist, and Luella threw a hissy fit, as it were, and screamed like a little child that she is, because she was not a good human being, folks. And that's when Luella saw the film, and then was just like, "You're gonna have the biggest lawsuit on your hands, and my boss won't tolerate it." And me. That I find interesting is that even though Hedda kind of threw Orson under the bus, so to speak, he still appreciated Hedda and even said later on, like, I totally get why she did it. If you are a woman working in that industry and you have a chance to have this big scoop, I'd take it. Yeah, of course. It's interesting from that perspective. But all those episodes that are currently available that exist are on that IU Bloomington site. And I will post the link here in a second while Buck wraps us up.
There's two good stories about the almanac I can share. After that, it was done from his home on Sunday. And George Fenneman, the announcer for You Bet Your Life, was the announcer for a while. Well, one time it was done live. One time he couldn't see Orson, and it was showtime. It was airtime. He was reading the announcement, and he heard that big flush, and Orson stepped out of the bathroom, and that went over the air. And the other time was he was married to Rita Hayworth at the time.
Yeah.
And George was there, and Orson had a little daughter. He said, "Why don't you go up and get your mom and have her come down and do the radio show?" And the girl came running down and just laughed. And she said, "Well, Mom ain't going to do your radio show." Those are the two famous stories about the almanac.
That's great. And he had Dennis Day on sometimes. He had a number of folks that do a lot of guest appearances on things. Lucille Ball was on there. I mean, just a lot of different folks. So it's definitely one that we're looking at after we're done with the commentaries and everything. It's probably going to be the next thing that we bring to you on our Orson Welles Wednesdays are going to be the almanacs. We'll see if we can make it through all the almanacs, or if we feel like, okay, this is, we'll do at least 3 or 4.
I'll do it. I don't care if I'm alone. I'll make my own Zoom room.
Okay. It might just turn into the Zach Almanac show, but we'll see.
One of the reasons I'm glad we were able to do this panel, and want to thank you all for doing it as we're drawing to a close, is that I love talking about Jack Benny, but I love talking about Orson Welles, and I love defending Orson Welles because he's not the sole egomaniac, spoiled child that everybody thinks he is. He was one of our greatest cinematic artists, and he gets underappreciated even to this day, especially by David Fincher. But that's neither here nor there.
Well, and we've been doing talking about his 15-minute commentaries that he did in 46 and 47. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And it's so much fun to talk about him. But the joke always is he fits so much into 15 minutes. We usually end up doing an introduction that's like a half hour, 45 minutes long before we get to his 15 minutes. And then I always have people commenting, "Oh, we just listened to what you guys had to say, and then I don't listen to Orson." I'm like, "No, that's why you're here. Listen to Orson."
Remember,
don't listen to
those are employees at Spotify who told us that. Remember, they said, "Yeah, they only listen to the beginning, and then they don't listen to Orson Welles."
And that's when I said, "What do you know? Your top-rated program ain't worth nothing compared to Buck Benny."
You don't understand the concept of an intro. It's it's not the show anyway, but. No, we love to do it. So feel free to tune in any Wednesday to hear all of us chatting about Orson. It's always fun. Anyway, this was wonderful to be able to present this, to be able to talk. I've always wanted to do this at the convention. And Zach, because you know more about the history of the convention and stuff, I assume they've done like the arc, the Yosemite arc that someone's presented on that. And oh, well, look, we found something to maybe cover next year. I would love to talk about Yosemite arc.
That's the Jack Benny movie I wish got made.
Yeah,
that's the Jack Benny movie I wish got made. Yeah.
Okay, that's good. So there, look at that, a preview for next year. There you go. But I'll turn it back over to Zach, and what a fun thing! And I'm looking forward to this afternoon as Zach and I are going to interview Mr. Stewart, and that is going to be wonderful. Stuart Kane, so that should be delightful. And thank you so much, Vincent, for coming and joining us. Kathy, man, I mean, I was thinking about how I didn't get a chance to really introduce Kathy the way I really wanted to, but Kathy does more of my podcasts than anybody else, and I just love having her. She's a wonderful partner to have, and we just have fun.
It's because you are a fabulous, knowledgeable, creative, and generous host, Daryl. You're the best.